For 45 years, David Greenglass carried a secret about the testimony that sent his sister to the electric chair. The confession he gave to prosecutors in 1951 had sealed Ethel Rosenberg's fate, and when he finally admitted the truth in 1996, he would tell a reporter that he slept very well. David Greenglass was born on March 2, 1922, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the youngest of 3 children in a family of Jewish immigrants who had fled poverty and persecution in Eastern Europe for the crowded tenements of New York City. His father, Barnett Greenglass, had emigrated from Minsk in the Russian Empire, and his mother, Testified, from Combornia in Austrian Galicia. And together, they had built a modest life in a neighborhood where Yiddish was spoken more commonly than English, and where entire families often shared 3-room apartments with inadequate heat and unreliable plumbing. David grew up in this world of pushcarts and synagogues, of communal meals and collective struggle, in an environment where political radicalism was not exceptional but ordinary, where socialism and communism were discussed at kitchen tables with the same familiarity that other families might discuss baseball or weather. Ethel, born September 28, 1915, was David's older sister by 7 years, and by all accounts she had been both protective of her younger brother and ambitious for a life beyond the limitations of the Lower East Side. She sang at neighborhood events, worked as a clerk to help support the family, and became involved in labor organizing and leftist politics during the 1930s, activities that would introduce her to Julius Rosenberg, an electrical engineering student at City College of New York, who shared her political convictions and her belief that the Soviet Union represented humanity's best hope for a just society. They married on June 18, 1939, when Ethel was 23 and Julius was 21, and moved into an apartment on the Lower East Side where they would raise 2 sons, Michael, born in 1943, and Robert, born in 1947. David Greenglass, by contrast, was a young man whose defining characteristic was not ideological fervor, but a kind of practical lethargy that required significant motivation to overcome. He had joined the Young Communist League in 1943, more out of family expectation and the influence of his brother-in-law than from any deep personal commitment to revolutionary politics, and he had never progressed to full membership in the Communist Party, in part because doing so would have required him to wake before dawn on weekends to deliver the Daily Worker to tenements throughout the neighborhood. This pattern of requiring compelling reasons to exert himself would persist throughout his life. On July 16, 1945, he would sleep through the first atomic bomb test at Alamogordo, New Mexico, despite being stationed at Los Alamos and having access to advanced knowledge of the event. A detail that would later seem almost absurdly characteristic of a man who had been accused of stealing the secret of the atomic bomb for the Soviet Union. But in 1944, David Greenglass was not yet a spy or a witness or a figure of historical infamy. He was a 22-year-old Army machinist, married to Ruth Prince, whom he had wed in 1942, and he was about to receive orders that would place him at the center of the most closely guarded military project in American history, and would eventually make him responsible for sending his sister to her death. Julius Rosenberg, who had by this time been working for Soviet intelligence for several years, saw in his brother-in-law not a committed revolutionary, but an opportunity, someone with access, someone who could be persuaded, someone whose loyalty to family might be redirected toward a cause that Julius believed transcended national boundaries. By August 1944, David Greenglass had been transferred to Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Julius Rosenberg had already begun planning how to turn that transfer into an intelligence operation. Los Alamos, New Mexico, in August 1944, was a sprawling complex of laboratories and housing units built on a remote mesa, where approximately 6,000 scientists, engineers, military personnel, and support staff worked on what would become the Manhattan Project's central mission, the design and construction of an atomic bomb. Security at the facility was comprehensive, compartmentalized, and designed to prevent any single individual from understanding the full scope of the work being conducted. But David Greenglass, assigned to the Special Engineering Detachment as a machinist working on the implosion program, discovered that compartmentalization was more theoretical than practical. The scientists and mathematicians, many of them recent refugees from European fascism, who viewed their work as a moral imperative, spoke openly about their research in common areas, answered questions from curious enlisted men, and occasionally invited machinists like Greenglass to attend seminars where complex theoretical problems were discussed with an assumption of shared purpose that rendered security protocols largely ineffective. David Greenglass later recalled that he simply listened, that he asked occasional questions that were answered without suspicion, and that over the course of several months, he accumulated a detailed understanding of the implosion lens design, the basic principles of plutonium compression, and the general architecture of the weapon being developed. This information, while incomplete and lacking the sophisticated mathematical framework that made it operationally useful, was nevertheless classified at the highest levels. And when Julius Rosenberg learned of his brother-in-law's assignment through a letter from Ruth Greenglass, he recognized immediately that David represented a significant intelligence opportunity. The recruitment occurred in September 1944, when Ruth Greenglass traveled from New York to Albuquerque to visit her husband during a brief leave period. She arrived with instructions from Julius Rosenberg, who had explained that the Soviet Union, as an ally of the United States in the war against fascism, deserved to have the same scientific knowledge that America possessed, and that sharing this information was not betrayal, but solidarity. Ruth presented this argument to David, who agreed without extensive deliberation, motivated not by ideological commitment or financial incentive, but by what he would later describe as hero worship of Julius Rosenberg, a man he admired and wished to please. The decision to become a Soviet intelligence source was made in a hotel room in Albuquerque over the course of a single conversation, and within weeks, David Greenglass had begun passing handwritten notes and rough sketches to his wife, who carried them back to New York and delivered them to Julius, who in turn passed them to his Soviet handler, Alexander Feklisov. The mechanics of the operation were simple. Ruth Greenglass would visit Albuquerque approximately once every 6 weeks. David would provide whatever information he had accumulated during the interval, and Ruth would return to New York with the materials concealed in her luggage or handbag. To authenticate future couriers in case Ruth was unavailable, Julius Rosenberg devised a recognition signal involving a Jell-O box cut in half, with one piece given to Ruth and the other to be carried by any Soviet courier who might need to make contact with David directly. This detail, the Jell-O box cut into matching halves like a prop from a spy novel, would later captivate the jury at the Rosenberg trial with its simplicity and its suggestion of careful planning. By early 1945, David Greenglass had passed multiple batches of information to the Soviet Union through this network, including sketches of the high-explosive lens system and descriptions of the implosion mechanism. The unraveling of the Soviet atomic spy ring began not in the United States, but in London, where British intelligence had been monitoring Klaus Fuchs, a physicist who had worked at Los Alamos during the war and who had been passing far more valuable information to the Soviets than David Greenglass would ever possess. Fuchs, a German-born refugee who had fled Nazi persecution and become a naturalized British citizen, had maintained ideological commitment to communism throughout his scientific career. And when British investigators confronted him with evidence of his espionage activities in January 1950, he confessed with minimal resistance. His confession included detailed descriptions of his Soviet contacts, among them an American chemist named Harry Gold, who had served as a courier between Fuchs and Soviet intelligence officers operating in the United States. The FBI arrested Harry Gold in May 1950, and Gold, facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades in prison, cooperated immediately. He provided names, dates, locations, and operational details. That led investigators to multiple members of the Soviet intelligence network, including a U.S. Army machinist who had worked at Los Alamos and had passed atomic secrets through his wife to his brother-in-law. On June 15, 1950, federal agents arrived at David Greenglass's apartment on the Lower East Side and placed him under arrest for conspiracy to commit espionage. David Greenglass understood within hours of his arrest that he faced a choice between extended imprisonment and cooperation with federal prosecutors. His wife, Ruth, who had carried the classified materials from Albuquerque to New York and had been deeply involved in the espionage operation, was clearly vulnerable to prosecution as well, and their two young children would be left without parents if both David and Ruth were convicted and incarcerated. The FBI made the calculus explicit. If David provided testimony that implicated Julius Rosenberg and any other members of the spy ring, Ruth would not be charged. If David refused to cooperate, Ruth would be arrested, indicted, and likely convicted alongside her husband. The decision took less than a week. David Greenglass agreed to testify against Julius Rosenberg, and in doing so, he set in motion a series of events that would lead to his sister's arrest, conviction, and execution. Though at the time of his initial cooperation, Ethel Rosenberg was not yet a target of the investigation. Ethel Rosenberg, 34 years old, mother of two young sons, was arrested on August 11, 1950, not because the FBI had accumulated evidence of her involvement in espionage, but because J. Edgar Hoover believed she could be used as leverage to pressure Julius Rosenberg into confessing and naming other members of the Soviet spy ring. An internal memorandum from an assistant attorney general, written shortly before Ethel's arrest, stated explicitly that there was insufficient evidence to charge her with espionage, but recommended her arrest anyway on the grounds that she could be used as a lever against her husband. The strategy was straightforward and cynical. If Julius believed that his wife would face prosecution, conviction, and potentially the death penalty, he might choose to cooperate with investigators in exchange for leniency for Ethel and himself. Julius Rosenberg was arrested the same day, and both were charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. Their sons, Michael, age 7, and Robert, age 3, were placed temporarily with relatives while their parents were held without bail in federal detention. The arrests made national headlines, framed by prosecutors and media coverage as a major breakthrough in the investigation of atomic espionage. Though at the time of the arrests, the evidence against Ethel consisted primarily of the fact that she was married to Julius and was the sister of David Greenglass. On August 7, 1950, 4 days before Ethel's arrest, David Greenglass appeared before a federal grand jury to provide testimony about the espionage operation he had participated in at Los Alamos. The grand jury proceedings were secret, as all grand jury proceedings are, and David's testimony that day would remain sealed and unavailable to defense attorneys, to the public, and to historians for more than 6 decades. In that testimony, David Greenglass described his own involvement in passing classified information to Julius Rosenberg, detailed the recognition signals and courier arrangements, and answered questions about who else had been involved in the conspiracy. When asked specifically about his sister's role in the espionage operation, David Greenglass told the grand jury that Ethel had not been involved. When prosecutors pressed him on whether Ethel had ever discussed espionage with him, David stated clearly, "My sister has never spoken to me about this subject." When asked if he had ever spoken to Ethel about passing information to Julius, David responded, "I never spoke to my sister about this at all." This testimony, given under oath 4 days before Ethel's arrest, directly contradicted the theory that would later be presented at trial. Between August 1950 and February 1951, David Greenglass's account of his sister's involvement in the Soviet espionage operation underwent a transformation that would prove decisive at trial. In his initial grand jury testimony in August, he had explicitly denied that Ethel had any knowledge of or participation in the conspiracy. In conversations with FBI agents during the months following his arrest, he had maintained that same position, describing Ethel as uninvolved and unaware of the activities that had occupied her husband and her brother. But in February 1951, exactly 10 days before the Rosenberg trial was scheduled to begin, David Greenglass provided prosecutors with a new statement that introduced a detail absent from all previous accounts, a detail that would become the single most incriminating piece of evidence against his sister. Ethel, David now claimed, had typed his handwritten notes. The claim was specific enough to seem credible and significant enough to establish active participation rather than passive awareness. According to this revised account, in September 1945, David had traveled from Los Alamos to New York while on leave and had met with Julius at the Rosenberg apartment to provide information about the implosion lens design. David had arrived with handwritten notes describing the technical specifications, and Ethel, present in the apartment, had sat down at a portable Remington typewriter and had typed the notes into a clean copy suitable for transmission to Soviet intelligence. This single act, the typing of classified information, transformed Ethel from a woman who might have suspected her husband's activities into a woman who had actively facilitated espionage. Ruth Greenglass corroborated this version of events when she testified, confirming that she had witnessed Ethel typing the notes in the Rosenberg living room. The consistency between David's testimony and Ruth's testimony gave the claim an appearance of reliability that prosecutors would exploit throughout the trial, though David would later admit that he had based his account entirely on Ruth's recollection rather than his own memory, and that he could not actually remember whether the typing had occurred at all. The timing of this revised testimony was not coincidental. In the months following the arrests, federal prosecutors had made clear to David Greenglass and his attorney that Ruth's freedom depended on David's cooperation, and that cooperation meant providing testimony sufficient to convict both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Ruth had been named as a co-conspirator, but had not been indicted, a status that could change at any moment if prosecutors decided that David's testimony was inadequate or insufficiently damaging. The implicit bargain was straightforward. If David testified in a manner that secured convictions, Ruth would remain free to care for their 2 young children. If David's testimony failed to satisfy prosecutors, Ruth would face the same charges, the same trial, and the same potential consequences as Ethel. 1 month before the trial began, a federal prosecutor appeared before a congressional committee and stated with remarkable candor that the case against Ethel Rosenberg was not strong, but that her conviction was important for purposes of deterrence. The government's strategy had never been about Ethel's actual involvement in espionage. It had been about creating sufficient pressure on Julius to force a confession. And when that strategy failed to produce cooperation, about ensuring that both Rosenbergs received the harshest possible sentences as a warning to others who might consider similar activities. David Greenglass understood what was being asked of him, and he made his choice. Judge Irving Kaufman, who would preside over the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, was a staunch anti-communist who had previously sentenced communists convicted of lying to a grand jury to the maximum terms available, delivering statements from the bench that accused defendants of attempting to destroy the United States through their adherence to Soviet ideology. His appointment to the Rosenberg case was not random, and his conduct throughout the proceedings would reflect the broader atmosphere of suspicion and fear that characterized American politics in early 1951, a moment when the Korean War was producing daily casualty reports, when Senator Joseph McCarthy was conducting highly publicized investigations into communist infiltration of government agencies, and when the recent Soviet acquisition of atomic weapons had transformed Cold War tensions into existential dread. The trial began on March 6, 1951, in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg sat at the defense table alongside Morton Sobel, a co-defendant accused of participating in the same espionage network, while their attorney, Emanuel Bloch, prepared to argue that the evidence against his clients was circumstantial, unreliable, and tainted by the government's decision to offer leniency to witnesses in exchange for testimony. The prosecution's case would rest almost entirely on the testimony of David and Ruth Greenglass, who were the only witnesses to provide direct evidence linking the Rosenbergs to espionage activities. Other witnesses, including Max Ellicher, described peripheral activities and suspicious behavior, but only the Greenglasses could place classified documents in the Rosenbergs' hands. David Greenglass took the stand and described in careful detail how Julius Rosenberg had recruited him into Soviet intelligence work in 1944, how he had passed information from Los Alamos through Ruth to Julius, and how the recognition system involving the Jello box had been established to authenticate future couriers. He testified about meetings in the Rosenberg apartment, about conversations regarding what information would be most valuable to Soviet intelligence, and about his understanding that the materials he provided were being transmitted to Moscow. The jury, composed of 11 men and 1 woman, listened intently as David walked them through the mechanics of espionage, making the abstract concept of atomic spying concrete and comprehensible. Then David testified about the typing. In September 1945, he explained, he had traveled to New York while on leave from Los Alamos and had met with Julius to provide sketches and notes about the high-explosive lens system used in the implosion bomb. Ethel had been present in the apartment, and when David handed his handwritten notes to Julius, Ethel had sat down at a typewriter and had typed the information into a clean, legible format suitable for photographing and transmission. Ruth Greenglass, testifying immediately after her husband, confirmed this account, describing the scene in the Rosenberg living room and Ethel's participation in preparing the documents. The Jello box story, despite its seeming absurdity, had a powerful effect on the jury. David testified that Julius had cut a box of Jello in half, had kept one piece and given the other to Ruth, and that months later, a man had appeared at David's door in Albuquerque, had presented the matching half of the Jello box, and had announced that Julius had sent him. Because the two halves fit together perfectly, David had given the man sketches related to the atomic bomb design. No actual Jello box was produced at trial, only a facsimile, and no other witness mentioned the device in their FBI interviews. But the jury found the detail compelling, a concrete symbol of careful planning and deliberate conspiracy. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, when called to testify, invoked their Fifth Amendment rights when asked about Communist Party membership, a decision that in the atmosphere of 1951, many interpreted as confirmation of guilt. They denied all involvement in espionage, refused to provide names of associates, and maintained that David Greenglass was lying, possibly motivated by bitterness over a failed business partnership that had involved Julius and David years earlier. Emanuel Bloch attempted to discredit David by highlighting inconsistencies in his testimony, by emphasizing the deal that had kept Ruth free, and by suggesting that David had fabricated evidence to protect himself and his wife. But the jury deliberated for less than 1 day before returning guilty verdicts against Julius Ethel and Morton Sobel on March 29, 1951. On April 5, 1951, 1 week after the guilty verdicts were delivered, Judge Kaufman sentenced Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to death in the electric chair, and in his sentencing statement, he blamed them not merely for espionage, but for the deaths of American soldiers in Korea, for the Soviet Union's acquisition of atomic weapons, and for the potential future nuclear wars that might result from their actions. The sentences were extraordinary, not only in their severity, but in their scope. No one had been executed for espionage in the United States during peacetime, and the Rosenbergs' crime had been conspiracy to commit espionage rather than actual transmission of information during wartime. Yet Kaufman framed their activities as directly responsible for geopolitical catastrophes that had complex causes extending far beyond anything two New York communists could have accomplished. David Greenglass, by contrast, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, a term that reflected his cooperation with prosecutors and his status as the government's primary witness. Morton Sobel received 30 years. The disparity between these sentences and the death penalties imposed on the Rosenbergs was stark enough that even some who believed in their guilt questioned whether execution was proportionate to the offense. For the next 2 years, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg fought to avoid execution through an appeals process that took their case to the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, which upheld the convictions, to the Supreme Court of the United States, which declined to review the case multiple times, and to 2 presidents seeking executive clemency. President Harry Truman, in his final months in office, denied their request, and President Dwight Eisenhower, newly inaugurated, also refused clemency, stating that the Rosenbergs had committed a crime worse than murder because they had endangered the entire nation. The final appeal, a stay of execution granted by Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, was overturned by the full court in a 6-3 vote on June 18, 1953. On June 19, 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. Julius died first at approximately 8:06 in the evening. Ethel died minutes later. Both had maintained their innocence until the end, and both left behind 2 young sons who would be raised by adoptive parents under different names. David Greenglass was released from federal prison in 1960 after serving 9.5 years of his 15-year sentence, and within weeks of his release, he had changed his name, relocated his family to Queens, New York, and disappeared into an anonymity that he would maintain for the next 30 years. The new identity was complete. David Greenglass, atomic spy, and brother who testified against his sister, ceased to exist in any public record, replaced by a man with a different name living on 228th Street in Laurelton, Queens, working ordinary jobs and raising his children in a quiet neighborhood where no one knew who he had been or what he had done. Ruth Greenglass, who had never been indicted despite her role in carrying classified materials from Albuquerque to New York, remained with her husband throughout his imprisonment and after his release, and together they constructed a life built on silence and deliberate obscurity. David became, in the decades following his release, a cultural symbol of family betrayal, his name invoked in discussions of loyalty and sacrifice. But the man himself remained invisible, protected by his new identity and his refusal to speak publicly about the case. Michael and Robert Rosenberg, who had been 6 and 10 years old when their parents were executed, were adopted by Abel and Ann Mirapol, a couple who gave them a new surname and a childhood shaped by the knowledge that their parents had died in the electric chair while maintaining their innocence. The Rosenberg case became a cause célèbre for the American left, with ongoing debates about whether Julius and Ethel had been guilty, whether the evidence had been sufficient, and whether the death penalty had been an act of justice or political vengeance. In the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union led to the opening of Soviet archives and the declassification of American intelligence intercepts known as the Venona documents, which confirmed that Julius Rosenberg had indeed been a Soviet spy, and that David Greenglass had passed atomic secrets through him to Soviet intelligence. Sam Roberts, a veteran reporter for the New York Times who had attended part of the Rosenberg trial as a child and had remained fascinated by the case for decades, began searching for David Greenglass in the late 1980s, tracking property records, tax documents, and obscure public filings until he finally located the man in 1990, living under an assumed name in Queens. Roberts approached him in his driveway one afternoon and asked if he would be willing to discuss the Rosenberg case, and David Greenglass refused, as he would continue to refuse for the next 6 years, until 1996, when Roberts made an offer that included payment for his story and assurances that the interviews would be conducted with discretion. David Greenglass agreed to talk, and over the course of more than 50 hours of recorded conversations, he provided Sam Roberts with detailed accounts of his recruitment into espionage, his work at Los Alamos, the mechanics of passing information to Julius Rosenberg, and his decision to testify against his sister. But the most significant revelations came when Roberts pressed David about the typing testimony, the claim that Ethel had typed his handwritten notes in September 1945, the detail that had sealed her conviction and justified her execution. David Greenglass admitted that he had lied. He told Roberts that he did not know who had typed the notes, that he could not remember the typing taking place, and that he had no independent memory of the event whatsoever. When asked how he had come to testify about something he could not remember, David explained that he had based his testimony entirely on what Ruth had told him, that Ruth believed she had seen Ethel typing, and that David had simply repeated Ruth's recollection as if it were his own. In the interviews, David stated clearly that he frankly thought Ruth had done the typing herself, but that he did not remember with any certainty. He acknowledged that Roy Cohn, the assistant prosecutor who would later become infamous as Senator Joseph McCarthy's chief counsel, had encouraged him to provide the typing testimony despite his lack of clear memory. When Roberts asked why David had been willing to testify about something he could not verify, David's answer was blunt and unadorned. He said that his wife was more important to him than his sister, that the choice had been between Ruth's freedom and Ethel's life, and that he had chosen Ruth without hesitation or doubt. The admission carried no evident remorse, no suggestion that David had spent the intervening decades tormented by guilt or haunted by the consequences of his testimony. He had made a calculation, had acted on that calculation, and had lived with the result for 45 years before finally acknowledging that the most incriminating evidence against his sister had been fabricated to protect his wife. In 2001, Sam Roberts published The Brother, a comprehensive account of David Greenglass's life and his role in the Rosenberg case, and CBS aired an interview with David on the program 60 Minutes 2, making his confession public for the first time. When the interviewer asked David how he felt about having testified falsely against his sister, David responded that as a spy who had turned his family in, he did not care, and that he slept very well. When pressed on whether the case haunted him, he noted that his wife had pointed out that they were still alive, a comment that seemed to summarize his entire approach to the moral questions raised by his testimony. David Greenglass, at 79 years old, had admitted to perjury that sent his sister to the electric chair, and he expressed no regret. The revelation that David Greenglass had committed perjury during the Rosenberg trial confirmed what some historians and activists had suspected for decades, that Ethel Rosenberg's conviction had rested on fabricated evidence, that the most incriminating testimony against her had been manufactured to satisfy prosecutorial demands, and that her execution had resulted not from her own actions, but from a strategic decision by her brother to sacrifice her in order to protect his wife. The admission, published in Roberts's book and broadcast on national television, reignited debates about the Rosenberg case that many Americans had considered settled, and it prompted renewed calls for official acknowledgement that Ethel Rosenberg had been wrongfully executed. Michael and Robert Meeropol, who had been raised under their adoptive surname and had spent their adult lives advocating for their parents' exoneration, intensified their efforts following David's confession. They had long maintained that their mother was innocent, and David's admission that he had lied about the typing provided concrete evidence that Ethel's conviction had been based on false testimony. The brothers launched petition campaigns, organized public events, and pressed government officials to review the case and issue a posthumous exoneration. In 2015, after years of legal battles initiated by Sam Roberts and various historical organizations, previously sealed grand jury testimony from August 1950 was finally released to the public. The documents confirmed what David had told Roberts in private. In his initial grand jury testimony, given just days before Ethel's arrest, David Greenglass had explicitly denied that his sister had any involvement in the espionage operation, had stated that she had never spoken to him about the subject, and had provided no evidence whatsoever that she had participated in typing documents or facilitating the transmission of classified information. The grand jury testimony that prosecutors had withheld from the defense during the trial directly contradicted the testimony that David and Ruth had presented in court 7 months later. On September 28, 2015, what would have been Ethel Rosenberg's 100th birthday, 13 members of the New York City Council and the Manhattan Borough President issued proclamations declaring that Ethel had been wrongfully executed, formal acknowledgments that carried symbolic weight but no legal authority to alter the historical record. A petition calling for federal exoneration of Ethel Rosenberg gathered more than 60,000 signatures before being delivered to the Attorney General and the President in 2016, though no official action resulted from the appeal. In 2024, an additional document emerged from declassified National Security Agency files. A memorandum dated August 22, 1950, authored by Meredith Gardner, the chief cryptanalyst who had worked on the Venona project, stated explicitly that after reviewing Soviet intelligence intercepts, he had concluded that Ethel Rosenberg was not a spy. The memo, written 10 days after Ethel's arrest, demonstrated that the United States government had possessed evidence of her minimal involvement before her trial began, yet had proceeded with prosecution, conviction, and execution anyway. The information that David Greenglass had passed to Soviet intelligence, when examined by nuclear scientists and weapons experts in the decades following the trial, was generally assessed as crude, incomplete, and of limited value. David Greenglass died on July 1, 2014, at the age of 92, having spent the final 18 years of his life as the man who had publicly admitted that he lied under oath to send his sister to the electric chair, and who had stated, without apparent remorse, that he slept very well. He had continued to live under his assumed identity in the years following his confession to Sam Roberts, maintaining the anonymity he had constructed in 1960, even as his birth name became synonymous with family betrayal and self-preservation, at catastrophic cost to others. Ruth Greenglass had remained with him until her death, and together they had raised their children and grandchildren in the quiet obscurity they had built from the wreckage of the Rosenberg case. David never publicly recanted his statement that he did not care about the consequences of his testimony, never expressed regret for the choice he had made in 1951, and never acknowledged that the information he provided to prosecutors had been anything other than necessary to protect his wife and children. He died as he had lived after 1960, as someone else, though history would remember him as David Greenglass. In the end, the testimony that David Greenglass gave in March 1951 sent two people to the electric chair at Sing Sing prison, one guilty of conspiracy to commit espionage, and one guilty primarily of being married to a spy and being the sister of a witness who needed to protect his wife. The distinction between these two forms of guilt, between active participation in atomic espionage and passive awareness of a husband's activities, should have been meaningful in a legal system that claims to proportion punishment to culpability. But in the context of 1951, when Cold War anxieties had transformed reasoned judgment into existential panic, the distinction collapsed under the weight of prosecutorial strategy and judicial fervor. David Greenglass made a choice in February 1951 that most people, when confronted honestly with the same circumstances, might understand even if they could not justify. He was offered a transaction, his sister's life in exchange for his wife's freedom. And he accepted the terms without the hesitation that might have complicated the decision or the guilt that might have made it unbearable afterward. The choice was not between right and wrong in any abstract moral sense, but between two people he loved, and he chose the person who shared his bed and raised his children over the person who shared his blood and his childhood. This is not an unusual calculation. What made David Greenglass unusual was not the choice itself, but his willingness to admit decades later that the evidence supporting that choice had been fabricated, and his apparent absence of remorse for having fabricated it. When David told Sam Roberts in 1996 that he could not remember whether Ethel had typed the notes, that he had based his testimony on his wife's recollection rather than his own memory, and that he frankly thought Ruth had done the typing herself, he was admitting to perjury that had served as the linchpin of the prosecution's case against his sister. Without the typing testimony, Ethel Rosenberg was a woman who had lived in an apartment where espionage was discussed, who had probably known what her husband was doing, and who had chosen not to inform authorities about activities that she may have disagreed with or may have tacitly supported. With the typing testimony, she became an active participant, someone who had sat down at a typewriter and had transformed classified information into a format suitable for transmission to Moscow. The difference between these two characterizations was the difference between a long prison sentence and death in the electric chair. The question of whether truth matters when it arrives too late is not rhetorical. Ethel Rosenberg was executed on June 19, 1953, and no amount of subsequent revelation could return her to life, restore her to her sons, or undo the fact that she died protesting her innocence while the government that killed her possessed evidence suggesting that her protests were largely accurate. David Greenglass's confession in 1996, 43 years after his sister's execution, changed the historical record but altered nothing material. It confirmed what some had suspected, vindicated those who had argued for Ethel's innocence, and provided her sons with official acknowledgement that their mother had been wrongfully convicted, but it did not constitute justice in any sense that could compensate for what had been taken. David Greenglass's legacy is not complicated by moral ambiguity, but defined by moral clarity. He was a spy who passed atomic secrets to the Soviet Union during World War II, motivated not by ideology, but by admiration for his brother-in-law, and a vague sense that sharing scientific knowledge with an ally was reasonable. He was a witness who testified against his sister based on testimony he later admitted was false, motivated not by malice, but by the desire to keep his wife out of prison. He was a man who lived for 45 years with the knowledge that his testimony had sent his sister to her death, and who, when finally confronted with that knowledge in public, stated that he did not care and that he slept very well. These facts do not require interpretation or context to be understood. They are simply what happened. The Rosenberg case remains one of the most controversial episodes of the Cold War era, not because the facts are unclear, but because the facts reveal a justice system that prioritized deterrence over accuracy, that used family members as leverage against defendants, and that executed a woman based on testimony that the witness himself would later acknowledge was unreliable. Julius Rosenberg was guilty of espionage. David Greenglass was guilty of espionage. Ethel Rosenberg was guilty of being related to both of them, and in 1951, in the atmosphere of McCarthyism and Cold War paranoia, that was sufficient. When David Greenglass said he slept very well, he was not confessing to a troubled conscience or revealing hidden torment. He was stating a fact about a man who had made a calculation, who had acted on that calculation, and who had lived with the consequences for nearly half a century before admitting that the most damning evidence had been a lie constructed to save one family member by sacrificing another.